Chapter 6, The Duel for North America, 1608 to 1763, and I apologize, I've got a little bit of a cold. Let's get started. A couple key points to get started. First of all, the British victory in the French and Indian War removes France from North America, and really we'll be looking more at the cause and effects of the war than we are the actual fighting of the war. Second of all, the war helps to unify the colonies and the colonists, first alongside Great Britain against France, but soon after that, actually against Britain itself. And finally, the war creates tension between Britain and her North American colonies. Specifically, the Proclamation of 1763 is going to do just that. Now, 1598, the Edict of Nantes was issued by the Crown, and it granted limited religious freedom to the Huguenots. These are the French Protestants. And it stopped the religious wars between the Protestants and the Catholics. And in a lot of ways, it was similar to the rise of Elizabeth in England, that it unified the country and opened the door for settlement of the New World. In 1608, Quebec was established. Samuel de Champlain is thought of as the father of New France. He's very energetic and quite a strong leader. And New France itself was under the direct control of the king and royal authority. So the people did not elect any representative assemblies. There is Louis XIV in charge. And you can see here sort of where the French were, which is just about everywhere except for Central and South America and California, where the Spanish were, and Florida, of course, and also the Atlantic seaboard here, where the British colonies were. You can see, though, that there are several French trading posts where the famed cours de bois were operating with a rendezvous system and the natives. But they're pretty much spread out, and they're very remote. And as we said in an earlier chapter, these were primarily French men in the New World. And you can see here that the population of New France was very small compared to that of British North America. One of the reasons why there was some intermarrying, as I said before, between French men and native women was that there were very few, if any, French women in the New World. And that also contributed to the slow population growth. Obviously, as we said, the French were out to acquire fur, and so they'll be trading with native peoples. And part of what they'll be trading, aside from guns and other manufactured goods, would be alcohol. And so that's going to be a major obstacle for native populations, as well as disease, of course, that are brought by Europeans in general. So the text did mention that there were Catholic missionaries, the Jesuits, that were involved with converting natives, but also perhaps in protecting them from the exploitation of these French fur traders. We see the founding of some modern-day cities, such as Detroit in 1701, as an effort to stop English encroachment into the Ohio Valley. That's the location we'll be focusing on for the beginning of the French and Indian War. Speaking of Cadillac, there's Elvis Presley's pink Cadillac right there. Plenty of those made in Detroit back in the day. We also see efforts in the Mississippi Gulf Basin and Louisiana, and specifically with New Orleans. So you can see here at the bottom of the slide, this is a city we'll come back to in a couple of chapters, as it was a major destination for crops being transported down the Mississippi River. So control of New Orleans will be significant soon enough for us. Illinois also was a major asset to New France, as it was a place where grain could be produced. So obviously we don't really need to concern ourselves with English monarchs, but this section, a big part of this section is about colonial unity. And so the text does reference that during King William's War, there is some unity amongst colonists as they are having conflict with the cours de bois and their Indian allies. And we also have talked quite a bit about this idea of salutary neglect that existed during this period of relative peace under George I. So obviously that allowed for colonial autonomy, political autonomy, and economic autonomy for that as well. Again, salutary neglect, make sure you know what that is. In terms of moving forward, we want to understand, though, that, again, as I said, that the 7 Years' War will be sort of the end of the French presence in North America. And it was a major turning point in terms of colonial unity. We're going to talk about that now. So in a nutshell, there were conflicting land claims in the Ohio Valley, and George Washington was sent with some Virginians to the area to expel the French that were in that region. Along the way, he encountered French troops near Fort Duquesne, and he actually killed the French leader and temporarily held the territory. French reinforcements came very soon after that. Washington and his men had built the famed Fort Necessity here, but they were defeated and they were forced to surrender. They were allowed to actually march back home with full honors. In 1755, the British in Nova Scotia attacked the French in Acadia. Many of those Acadians actually died as they were rounded up and kind of removed from the area. Many of them actually went to Louisiana and became Cajuns, right? Here's George Washington as a young man, you can see here. And here is a recreated Fort Necessity. Not looking too secure. But keep in mind that the French claims were quite extensive. As I showed you on the earlier map, while these were sort of not populated areas necessarily, but they were trading posts, the area that they covered was quite extensive. All right, so the French and Indian War officially started in 1754. It was part of a larger war, a global war called the 7 Years' War, which was fought in America, Europe, the West Indies, the Philippines, Africa, and in the high seas as well. In Europe, Britain and Prussia were allied against France, Spain, Austria, and Russia. And French wasted many troops in Europe and therefore were unable to put as many troops into North America as they may have liked. You can see, again, this is not something you necessarily need to know, but several battles, quite a few battles were fought in Europe here, as you can see, but also in the New World. All right, so it's the French and Indian War, meaning the French have Indian allies, right? Well, that's mostly true, except for the Iroquois nation. And in 1754, the Albany Congress was actually called to try to pacify the Iroquois, and what was to happen was gifts were going to be given to the Iroquois to keep them loyal. Ben Franklin was a very prominent leader at this meeting, but as you can see, only 7 of the 13 colonies sent delegates to this meeting, and there's Ben Franklin right there. While there, Franklin and the delegates put together a plan for home rule, and they adopted this plan, which would unite all the colonies. Now, it's rejected by the colonies back home, as in the delegates return to their colonies and share the plan, and the colonists there say, no, we need more independence from this sort of unified group. And London felt that it was too much independence for the colonies in general, so they also rejected this. You can see the Joan or Die cartoon here in the slide, actually. And as it says in the text, this was first used to help promote colonial unity against the French, but it would resurface later on as a way to unite the colonies against Britain. So I already said we're not going to really talk too much about the fighting of the French and Indian War, but there's a few points we should make on these next couple of slides about that. First of all, you see 1755, General Braddock. He's British. He'll take 2,000 men to capture Fort Duquesne. Much of that force were colonial militia, so you're going to see colonial buckskins fighting right alongside British regulars, and we'll come back to that point in a few. We also see them being defeated by a smaller French and Indian army, known as Braddock's Blunder. What that did was expose that perhaps the British are not as invincible as previously thought. Now, due to the loss of his troops, the whole frontier region from Pennsylvania to North Carolina was left open to Indian attack. George Washington was there, as you can see, with very few men trying to defend the area. The British turned their attention elsewhere. In 1756, they launched a full-scale invasion of Canada. And here's a picture depicting those colonial militiamen, again, baptized by fire, I think it said in the text, and certainly gaining a lot of confidence militarily, as opposed to the British regulars who sort of looked down upon them as a ragtag bunch that were undisciplined and untrained. 1757, William Pitt takes charge of the British military leadership in North America, and he attacked and captured Louisbourg in 1758. And we have the Battle of Quebec in 1759. William Pitt chose James Wolfe to lead this against the French Marquis de Montcalm. The French and the British armies faced each other on the plains of Abraham, and both leaders were fatally wounded, but the English won. Here is a painting depicting the death of General Wolfe, You can see a Native American here who's looking on to this. He must be allied with the British, right? This is a painting I like to use later on in the years. We talk about different stereotypes of natives mainly the noble savage and the ignoble savage. Montreal fell quickly after Quebec in 1760, and the Treaty of Paris was signed 3 years later. This ended the war and threw the French off the continent of North America. The British then become the dominant power in North America, as the Spanish they're still around, but their settlements are not as heavily populated as you might think. And you can see here, I took these two maps right from the book 6.7a and 6.7b, sort of the changing presence here, and you'll notice that the green, which represents the French on the left, is gone. Now, that doesn't mean that all Frenchmen were off the continent. It means French as a sort of colonial power, as a national power, is no longer there. Again, focus in on these points here. First of all, there is increased colonial confidence, especially militarily speaking. And, again, the British regulars are fighting alongside the buckskins, but they look down on these colonial militiamen, while the militiamen are saying, hey, we just actually secured this victory with you, and now you're going to restrict our freedom to access that land. That's going to be a major point of contention. There's a question as to whether or not colonists are British. They certainly see themselves as equal to Britons in Britain, but that's not necessarily the way that the British see the colonists. In fact, the colonists kind of see themselves as sort of the extension of British society, in fact, a more evolved British society, or as our text says, on the cutting edge of British civilization, meaning that they are the most refined form of it. Smuggling is something we've talked about quite a few times. It actually occurred during the war itself. Some goods were smuggled to the French, which then made their way to their Indian allies, which actually hurt the British cause. But again, you could say this is evidence of sort of colonial economic autonomy and kind of challenging this very rigid mercantilistic policy. Again, mercantilism was designed to have colonies that would enrich the parent state. Well, those colonies, you could say, have sort of outgrown that relationship and are being restricted by this economic approach. The colonists also are not necessarily united in terms of what they want to contribute to the war effort. The text suggests that perhaps they want the rights of Englishmen, but they're not really prepared to fulfill the duties or obligations of Englishmen, until they're later promised reimbursement by William Pitt and begin to actually donate money to the cause. There's also intercolonial disunity that was caused by many factors, including just regional differences and diversity and different views, different worldly views, different views on religion, you could say. But as I've said a couple times now, the French and Indian War began to break down those barriers, and really promote colonial unity. 1763, right after the war's end, the Ottawa chief Pontiac did lead several tribes in a violent campaign to drive the British out of the Ohio country. These would be the natives that are left after the French are expelled, and so they've got to deal with the British now, and this was their solution to do that. They captured Detroit in the spring of that year and overran all but 3 British outposts west of the Appalachians, and the British will, of course, respond and eventually defeat the Indians. What results from this, though, is the Proclamation of 1763. Here are the sites of many of those battles you can see here in 1763. And here, of course, is the kicker. The Proclamation of 1763 was a way for the British to protect their colonial possessions and their colonial inhabitants, and it prevented their settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains. It was made to prevent conflict between the natives and settlers and other European powers, Europeans in general, not European powers, that were still in the region. Many colonists just absolutely ignored this, and headed west out into the frontier for the resources and opportunity that it provided. Here is that proclamation line you can see. And of course, it'll be a major catalyst, this Proclamation of 1763, into the next phase of our study, which will be outright rebellion. That's it for Chapter 6. Not a lot to say about the fighting of the war itself. Understand the causes of the war, understand the effects of the war, mainly colonial unity and a divide between Britain and her colonies. If you have any questions, please post them on the Google or just let me know in class. Take care.